Power in Ironfang Court is loud, metal on stone, laughter like threats, banners burning above a feast table packed with wolves who think they're untouchable. But real danger doesn't clank when it walks. It moves with lowered eyes and steady hands, carrying a tray like it weighs nothing, until the wrong alpha decides to test what rejected really means. They pass between tables unnoticed. They keep their heads bowed. They carry their violence folded neatly inside their ribs, like a letter sealed for the right moment. Vale was built to be overlooked. Tonight, Ironfang Court is roaring with celebration, Night of Embers, the feast where the noble houses drink deep and remind each other who owns the world. The great hall is a river of torchlight and red gold sigils, long tables crowded with armored alphas whose voices strike like blades. Every seat feels like a throne. Every glance feels like judgment. And down the center aisle, moving between them with a tray balanced at one steady hip, is a girl they've already decided doesn't count. A rejected Omega. Not the kind that inspires pity. The kind that inspires boredom. A tolerated flaw in the palace inventory, useful for pouring wine, carrying plates, and absorbing humiliation with a smile that never reaches her eyes. To the court, she is a servant in rough spun sleeves, shoulders rounded on purpose, gaze lowered like an apology. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the chapter where everything unravels. Maris performs that role flawlessly. She doesn't rush. Rushing draws attention. She doesn't meet anyone's stare. Staring invites a challenge. She times her steps to the swell of conversation, slips into the blind spots of men who have never considered she might be worth watching. She has had 3 years to perfect the craft of being nothing. Long sleeves conceal what the court would call punishment, if they bothered to look close enough, thin pale lines that map her forearms, her wrists, her collarbone. But Maris knows those scars are not simply cruelty's leftovers. They are proof of conditioning. Training marks. Reminders that pain can be measured, endured, converted into obedience, or into something sharper. Her voice stays quiet not because she's meek, but because soft sounds don't trigger tempers. Her breathing stays slow not because she's calm, but because the body does not shake when it is controlled. Even as she pours wine for men who would laugh if she died, part of her counts exits, pillars, angles, reflexes that don't belong to a kitchen girl. At the far end of the hall, where the heat is brightest and the attention gathers like wolves around blood, Prince Kaelan Draven lounges among his companions as if the throne has already accepted him. The king's son wears entitlement the way others wear crowns. The court orbits him carefully, too eager to be noticed, too frightened to become his entertainment. Maris has learned a simple law of survival in Ironfang: never become interesting. So when she feels it, when the weight of a gaze hooks into her back like a claw, her first instinct is to pretend she doesn't. She keeps walking. Keeps pouring. Keeps shrinking. But Kaelan's attention doesn't slide away. It lands. A small pause. A shift in the prince's posture. A lazy tilt of his head that makes nearby nobles go quieter, as if they've felt thunder in their bones. Maris doesn't look up. She doesn't need to. She knows that look. It's the look of a predator choosing a toy in a room full of witnesses. And the worst part, the part that makes her fingers tighten around the tray just once, just enough, isn't fear. It's recognition. Because somewhere beneath the servant's mask, buried under years of forced silence and careful obedience, something inside her lifts its head like a blade being unsheathed. She has spent so long pretending she isn't dangerous that even she almost believed it. Almost. And that is where her story truly begins, years earlier, in the place the Crown swore never existed, where rejected Omegas weren't trained to serve, they were trained to disappear. Maris remembered the first time she learned what that truly meant. Not the soft kind of disappearing servants practiced, shoulders rounded, eyes down, voice swallowed. This was a different vanishing. Engineered. Measured. Stripped down until there was nothing left for the world to grab. It began with a door. A plain iron door buried beneath a supply wing that wasn't supposed to have a lower level. No banners. No sigils. No guards posted where curious nobles might wander. Just stone steps descending into colder air, each one swallowing sound as if the castle itself didn't want to remember what it kept beneath its feet. Maris had been 16. Maybe. Time was harder to count back then, when days were marked by whistles and bells and the number of breaths you were allowed before a punishment began. She'd stood at the top of those steps with her wrists bound in cord that bit into skin, her hair still tangled from the transport wagon, her throat raw from not speaking. The Alpha escort hadn't looked at her once. Omegas were parcels. Rejected Omegas were mistakes. Mistakes didn't deserve eye contact. The door opened without ceremony. Warm torchlight should have spilled out. Instead came something sharper, white lamplight that made the stone look bleached, the shadows too clean. The air smelled of metal and antiseptic and old sweat. It smelled like a place where bodies were measured for usefulness. Inside, the corridor ran straight as a blade. Rooms branched off like ribs. A boot scuffed somewhere. A low voice spoke numbers. A small sound, soft, broken, was cut off abruptly. Maris had gone still. Not because she was brave. Because fear was loud, and loud things were noticed. That was the first lesson they taught her, even before they told her the program's name. Notice is a leash. A woman in dark uniform met them halfway down the corridor. She wasn't dressed like palace staff. No crest. No silk. Her sleeves were fitted for movement, her hair pinned back to expose a long throat and a hard jaw. Her eyes swept Maris the way a knife sweeps a whetstone, testing, weighing. Rejected, she asked the escort. Yes. Family? None recognized. Bonded? No. The woman's gaze settled on Maris for the first time. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. Clinical. Good, she said, as if confirming the quality of a tool. No one will ask where she went. Maris didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She tucked herself inward the way you fold paper into something smaller so it's harder to tear. The uniformed woman took the cord from the escort and replaced it with a metal cuff stamped with a number. Not a name. A number. Repeat it, the woman said. Maris stared at the cuff. The digits swam, refusing to become real. A slap landed across her mouth, quick, clean, not angry. Just instruction. Repeat it. Maris swallowed blood and forced the sound out, quiet as dust. 7. Again. 7. Your name is a liability, the woman said. Liabilities get killed. Numbers don't. Then she turned, and Maris followed because there was nothing else left to do. They led her into a room that looked like an infirmary without mercy. A single cot. A drain in the floor. A metal table lined with instruments. The light was bright enough to make her eyes sting. A man waited there in a coat too clean for a palace physician. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't pretend what they were doing was anything but what it was. "Hold still," he said. Hands pinned Maris's arms. A needle bit. Cold fire moved through her veins. Her muscles tried to lock, tried to fight, tried to flee, then stopped listening to her altogether. Panic would have been reasonable. But panic was also loud. Maris stared at the ceiling and taught herself to breathe through the terror without letting it show. In, out. In, out. If she became easy to manage, maybe she would be overlooked. If she was overlooked, maybe she would live. The man's voice drifted above her like fog. Baseline response, high. Pain threshold, unknown. Omega presentation, suppressed by stress. Useful. Mark her for conditioning. The uniformed woman made a note. She'll learn. Maris didn't know what conditioning meant then. She learned. It started with silence. They took her voice first, not by cutting out her tongue, but by teaching her what sound cost. Every time she spoke without permission, the light stayed on for hours. Every time she cried, the water in the wash basin was removed. Every time she begged, someone else in a neighboring room paid for it too. They trained her like that, by making her choices hurt other people. She learned that obedience wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon they used to aim her. Then came movement. A narrow training hall with padded walls and blood-stained mats. Instructors who never raised their voices because they didn't need to. They struck with efficiency, never wasting anger. Anger was messy. Messy left evidence. Maris was small. Rejected Omegas tended to be. The first time they put her against a larger trainee, she went down hard. Air left her lungs in a painful rush. She lay staring at the ceiling, ribs screaming, while an instructor crouched near her ear. "Don't fight strength," the instructor said. "Borrow it." A boot nudged her wrist into position. "Hands," the instructor murmured. "Your hands are your knives." They made her practice grips until her fingers bled. Wrist locks until her joints burned. How to turn a shove into a pivot. How to let someone's momentum do the work, like water finding the easiest path. Again. 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 Pain became a language. Maris learned to read it. She learned to take a hit without reacting. To breathe through nausea. To stand up without letting her face betray how close she was to blacking out. They were building something in her. Not courage. Not rage. Control. Weeks blurred into months. Sometimes, rarely, she saw other trainees in the corridor. Girls like her with bruises half hidden under long sleeves. With the same careful eyes. With the same quiet. No one spoke. Speaking risked names. Names risked attachment. Attachment was a weakness. Weakness got called. Maris learned to become a blank surface, no friendships, no loyalties, no softness anyone could pull on to make her move the way they wanted. If she felt anything, she learned to bury it so deep it couldn't be used against her. And still, at night, when the lights finally dimmed, she lay awake and listened. She listened to muffled sobs that went silent too suddenly. She listened to boots dragging someone down the corridor. She listened to the sound of a body hitting the drain floor in the infirmary room, over and over, until it became a rhythm the building swallowed without complaint. There were no banners in that place. But there was still hierarchy. Instructors sat at the top like blades waiting to fall. Operatives in training lived beneath them like ghosts. And above all of it, above even the men and women who ran the halls, was the knowledge that none of them existed. One afternoon, after a grueling session where Maris had been thrown hard enough to see stars, the uniformed woman returned. She watched Maris execute a wrist trap and pivot. Watched her hyperextend an opponent's joint until the bigger girl hit the mat with a sharp breath and a strangled cry. The instructor didn't praise. Praise made people hungry. Hungry people made mistakes. Instead, the woman said, again. Maris did it again. And again. On the fifth repetition, the woman finally nodded once, as if noting the quality of a forged blade. "You're learning to disappear," she said. Maris's throat tightened. The words that rose in her, "Where will you send me? Why me? What is this?" were swallowed before they could become sound. The woman's gaze flicked to the cuff on Maris's wrist. 7, she said, and for the first time it sounded like a name. Your job is not to be seen. Your job is to become a rumor after the fact. Maris's hand shook. Not from fear. From exhaustion. From the terror of realizing she was becoming exactly what they were shaping. The woman stepped closer until her shadow cut the sterile light across Maris's face. When you return to the world, she said, you will pour wine in halls like the one above us. You will walk between alphas who think they own the air. They will look through you. They will call you disposable. That is your camouflage. Maris forced herself to keep her expression empty. The woman continued, almost kindly, almost like she was explaining something to a child. You will be underestimated, she said. You will be ignored. You will be laughed at. A pause. And when the crown needs a throat opened without witnesses, or a letter stolen without footprints, or a traitor removed so cleanly the court blames fate. The woman's eyes sharpened. You will move. Maris stared at the floor. Her lungs felt tight, as if the room had shrunk around her. Do you understand? The woman asked. Maris did. Understanding didn't mean acceptance. It meant survival. She nodded once. Good, the woman said, and turned away. Then you can stop being a girl. That night, Maris lay in her cot and tried to remember her old name. It came to her like a distant sound, muffled behind stone. Maris. Maris Vale. It felt strange, foreign, too soft to belong in a place built of steel and silence. She repeated it in her head like a prayer until it began to fade, replaced by the number on her cuff and the cold, bright lessons. 7. Disappear. Borrow strength. Hands are knives. Notice is a leash. The next morning, they woke her before dawn. They stripped her of her thin blanket and marched her into a chamber she hadn't seen before. Larger. Colder. The walls here weren't padded. They were bare stone. A man stood in the center wearing a royal seal on his ring. He did not look like an instructor. He looked like the kind of man who signed papers that erased lives. He held a stack of documents. He did not address Maris directly. He spoke to the uniformed woman. The court wants the initiative dissolved. The uniformed woman's face did not change. Why? Politics, the man said. Budget. Public optics. A few nobles found a scent trail and began asking questions. Maris's pulse kicked once, hard. Questions meant light. Light meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The uniformed woman's voice stayed even. And the assets? The man's eyes flicked to Maris as if she were furniture. Contained. Or removed. Witnesses are inconvenient. Maris felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her. Removed. Contained. Words that meant corpses. The uniformed woman said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded. As you command, she said. Maris kept her face blank. But inside, something tightened, sharp and cold. Because she finally understood what the program truly was. Not training. Not service. A grave that walked. And somewhere, far above, past stone and sealed doors, Ironfang Court continued to blaze with banners and laughter, ignorant of the quiet machinery built beneath its feet. A burst of laughter in the banquet hall yanked Maris back to the present like a chain-snapping taut. Torchlight flickered across her tray. The warmth of the feast didn't reach the place inside her that had never thawed. Kaelin Draven's voice rose above the din, easy, amused, the kind of sound that made men around him laugh a fraction too fast. Maris felt it again, the hook of attention. She reached Kaelin's table with the smoothness of habit and stopped at the edge, waiting for an order like any other servant. For one heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the prince leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the nearest nobles quiet as if the hall itself was holding its breath. Come here, Kaelin said. Maris lowered her eyes another fraction. Yes, my prince. And as she stepped closer, she understood, quietly, clearly, without panic, that avoidance had ended. She had been chosen. The tray steady at her hip, her spine deliberately soft. The air around his table smelled of roasted meat and spiced wine and alpha heat, hot, arrogant, unquestioned. Men in armor leaned back in their chairs, half drunk on spectacle. Their laughter had the careless edge of people who had never paid for their cruelty. Kaelin's hand lifted, not to take the cup she offered, but to knock the pitcher against the rim. Wine jumped. A dark arc across the torchlight. It splashed over Maris's bodice, soaked into the rough fabric, ran warm down her stomach and into the folds of her skirt. For a heartbeat the hall didn't register it, then the nobles at his table erupted in laughter as if he'd performed a trick. Ah, Kaelin sighed, amused. Look at that. Clumsy. Maris swallowed. The wine clung to her skin like a brand. Her fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles went pale. She kept her gaze lowered, because her gaze was a door, and doors, once opened, invited entry. I apologize, my prince, she said, voice soft. I'll fetch another. Kaelin's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard. Not yet. Just enough pressure to make the message clear, you don't move unless I allow it. The laughter around them sharpened, pleased with itself. A few heads turned down the long aisle, drawn by the promise of humiliation like wolves scenting fresh blood. Across the hall, armored shoulders angled for a better view. The feast had been loud, now it became attentive. Maris stared at the prince's fingers on her skin, the way his thumb pressed the vein there as if testing how much it would take to bruise. Pain, she could handle. Pain was simple. Pain was honest. But exposure. Exposure was what killed. Kaelin leaned closer, his voice lowered, intimate enough to sound like kindness if you didn't know better. You're shaking. I'm not, my prince. His grip tightened a fraction. The cuff of her sleeve slid, revealing a thin pale line on her forearm before the fabric fell back into place. Kaelin's eyes caught it. His smile changed. Interest ignited behind it, lazy and cruel. "What's this?" he murmured, as though discovering a flaw in merchandise. "Someone's been handled rough." Maris's breath remained steady. In, out. In, out. A memory flashed, white light, a metal cuff, a woman's voice, "Notice is a leash." Kaelin lifted her wrist higher, turning it, displaying it to the table. "Look," he announced, loud enough for the nearby nobles to hear. "Our little rejected Omega has secrets." More laughter. A chair scraped. Someone whistled. Maris's mind moved in quiet calculations. Distance to nearest pillar, 3 steps. Nearest guard, 2 tables down, attention on the prince, not on her. Exit, beyond the far archway, blocked by bodies. Risk of resistance, immediate death. Risk of submission, unknown escalation. The last part was the problem. Because Kaelin wasn't satisfied with obedience. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the court to watch him extract it. He pulled her closer, forcing her body toward his knee, forcing her to bend. The tray dipped, plate slid a fraction. Maris compensated without spilling, pure muscle control, trained. Kaelin noticed that too. His eyes narrowed, as if irritated by competence in something that was supposed to be weak. "Careful," he said, mock gentle. "Wouldn't want you making a mess." Maris's jaw locked so hard it ached. "Let go," she thought, without forming the words. "Let go. Let go." But he didn't. He stood. The movement alone rippled through the surrounding tables. Alpha straightened, sensing entertainment. His chair fell back with a dull thud. He was taller than Maris by a head and a half, broad-shouldered, armored in dark leather and steel plates that caught the firelight. He still held her wrist. He held it like a trophy. "On your knees," Kaelin said, conversationally, as if requesting more wine. The hall quieted in a slow wave. Not silent yet, but the kind of hush that anticipates a scream. Maris's heartbeat remained controlled. Slow. Measured. A metronome. She pictured the training hall. Padded walls. Blood on mats. An instructor's voice at her ear, "Borrow strength. Don't fight it." If she dropped to her knees, it would be easier. It would satisfy him. It would end quickly. Or it would teach him that she could be bent any way he pleased. And once a prince learned that lesson, princes rarely stopped. Maris lifted her free hand and slowly, carefully, set the tray down on the edge of the table. A deliberate act. Hands visible. No sudden movement. "I'm sorry, my prince," she said. "I didn't mean to offend." Kaelin's mouth curled. "Oh, you didn't offend me." His eyes traveled down her wine-soaked bodice, the way a predator's gaze travels over prey. "You bored me." And boredom, he leaned closer, voice dropping to a purr only the nearest tables could hear, "is unforgivable." Then he jerked her forward. Maris's feet slid on the stone. The hall's torches flared in her peripheral vision, making the banners overhead seem like hanging tongues of blood. He shoved her back. Not enough to throw her. Just enough to make her stumble and catch herself. A test. The nobles laughed again, quick, sharp, hungry. Maris absorbed it. She recovered, posture still submissive, eyes still lowered. Kalen's expression darkened. He wanted her to break. So he made it physical. He kicked her. The strike landed low and brutal, a boot into her thigh and hip with enough force to send pain flaring up her spine. The world tilted. Her knee buckled. She hit the marble floor hard enough to knock air from her lungs. A few cups clattered. Someone gasped. Then the hall fell silent so suddenly it felt like being plunged underwater. Maris lay for a breath with her cheek against cold stone, wine and pain mixing into a sharp metallic taste. She could hear only the crackle of the braziers and the distant scrape of cutlery paused mid-meal. Kalen stepped around her like she was furniture. He crouched, close enough that his armor creaked. "Get up," he murmured. Not a command. A threat. Maris drew a slow breath. Her body catalogued injuries the way it had been taught, bruising, not break. Painful, manageable. She could stand. She could still play the servant. But Kalen's boot pinned the hem of her skirt. Trapping her. Ownership. He reached down and grabbed her by the throat. Not crushing. Not yet. Just enough pressure to tilt her head back and make her see him. That was the true violence. Because the moment her eyes rose, the mask thinned. Not shattered, Maris had too much practice for that, but thinned enough for something underneath to look out. Kalen's pupils dilated. He felt it. That flicker of something that didn't belong to prey. His grip tightened in reflex. "Look at me," he hissed. The stone pillar behind Maris's shoulders was cold and unforgiving. The prince's hand was warm and heavy at her throat. The hall watched, unmoving, dozens of armored alphas lined at long tables, faces half lit by fire, waiting for whatever came next. Maris's lungs wanted air. A memory surged up as if triggered by the pressure, white lights, a hand at her throat, an instructor murmuring calmly, "If they take your breath, take their balance." Her fingers twitched. Control demanded stillness. Survival demanded a decision. Maris's mind split cleanly into two truths. If she stayed prey, she might live tonight. If she stayed prey, she would die later, piece by piece, because Kalen would never let her go now that he'd tasted her helplessness. The decision arrived like a door slamming. No anger. No scream. Just a cold, precise click inside her. Maris moved. Her left hand came up, not grabbing, not clawing, placing two fingers against the inside of Kalen's wrist where tendons ran tight. Her right hand slid to his forearm, not to push, but to anchor. Kalen frowned, confused by the gentleness of it. Then Maris twisted. Not with strength. With leverage. A small rotation of her body, her hips turning under her, borrowing the prince's forward momentum as if it belonged to her. His grip on her throat loosened involuntarily, the joint protesting, the tendons strained in the wrong direction. His eyes widened. Maris rose with the motion, not standing up so much as pivoting, a smooth, trained spiral that brought her shoulder under his arm. Her forearm trapped his wrist against her collarbone for one heartbeat, locking the joint in a vulnerable angle. Kalen reacted then, fury flashing. He tried to wrench free. That was the moment Maris used. She stepped in close, close enough that his armor brushed her sleeve, and turned her hips again. A controlled pull. A sharp downward arc. Kalen's balance vanished. His body, built for dominance, obeyed physics instead. He hit the marble with a sound like falling meat, hard, shocked breath bursting from him as his face turned toward the stone. Maris followed him down, one knee near his ribs, one hand controlling his wrist. Then she hyperextended the joint. Not to break it. Just far enough to make him understand that she could. Kaelin's hand slapped the floor. His breath went ragged. His free arm flailed, useless. Maris remained still above him, posture calm, face blank, holding the Prince of Ironfang Court face down on marble like he weighed nothing at all. The hall froze. Dozens of alphas stared, minds failing to reconcile what their eyes reported. An Omega servant, rejected, disposable, had put the crown prince on the floor. And she wasn't trembling. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't even breathing hard. A chair creaked somewhere. A goblet tipped and rolled slowly until it tapped a table leg and stopped. Fire crackled. Somewhere far down the hall, a servant's plate slipped from numb fingers and shattered with a sound too loud in the silence. Kaelin snarled, twisting. "Get off me." Maris didn't tighten her grip. She didn't need to. Her control was in the angle, the leverage, the inevitability of pain if he moved wrong. "Stop," she said softly, as if speaking to a dog. Kaelin went still, not obedient, but trapped by his own anatomy. Then the first guard shifted, steel clinking. Another rose half out of his seat, hand hovering near a sword hilt. Protocol demanded they intervene. Instinct told them they were witnessing something impossible, and impossible things make trained men hesitate. Maris released him. Not with drama. Not with triumph. She let his wrist go and stepped back, raising both hands slowly, palms out. A servant's gesture. Non-threatening. Controlled. Her voice remained calm, measured to carry without provoking. "My prince attacked me," she said, speaking into the stunned quiet. I reacted. It was a careful phrasing. Reflex. Defense. Not rebellion. Kaelin pushed up on shaking arms, face flushed with rage, hair fallen across his forehead. His eyes were wild. He spat, pointing at her as though the act of pointing could restore hierarchy. "She assaulted me. Execute her. Now." No one moved. Because the room's certainty had cracked, and men don't like to step into a crack when they don't know how deep it goes. Kaelin's voice rose, frantic with humiliation. "Did you hear me? She's an Omega. She put hands on me." Maris stood very still, hands still raised, shoulders slightly hunched again, mask reassembled around the weapon inside her. Her throat burned where his fingers had been. Her hip throbbed. Pain blossomed. She ignored it. A new sound entered the hall then, slow, deliberate footsteps above. Not from the floor level. From the gallery. The upper level where the banners hung and the high seats overlooked the feast. Heads turned. And the room seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the presence descending. King Roderick Draven appeared at the top of the stairs like a shadow given shape. No fanfare. No shouted announcement. No flourish. Just a tall figure in dark, simple attire that made his authority feel even heavier, as if he didn't need adornment to be undeniable. His gaze swept the hall once, seeing everything, missing nothing. It landed on Kaelin half kneeling on the marble. Then on Maris, hands raised. For one heartbeat the king's expression didn't change. Then, very slightly, his eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with recognition. He descended without hurry, each step a quiet claim. The guard straightened as he approached, instinctively aligning to him the way iron filings align to a lodestone. Kalen surged to his feet when his father reached the floor. "Father, she attacked me." The king lifted a hand. Kalen stopped mid-sentence, frozen by a gesture so small it felt like sorcery. King Roderick's voice was low, carrying easily through the stunned quiet. "I saw." Kalen's mouth worked. He swallowed. "Then you know she." "I saw everything," the king said. His gaze returned to Maris. Not warm. Not kind. Assessing. As if she were a sealed letter he was deciding whether to open. "You," he said, and the single word pinned her more effectively than Kalen's hand ever had. Maris lowered her chin. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king's eyes flicked once, to her stance, her hands, the way her weight was balanced. To the angle of her shoulders. To the absence of panic. Then, softly, as if to himself, he murmured, "Efficient." The word rippled through the hall like a blade drawn half an inch from its sheath. Kalen snapped, desperate. "She humiliated me." King Roderick didn't look at his son. "You humiliated yourself." A collective inhale passed through the tables. Kalen went pale with fury. The king turned slightly and spoke to the nearest guards. "Detain her." Kalen's face lit. "Yes." "Kill her." "Detain," the king repeated, and there was iron in it now. "Not execute." The guards hesitated one final time, then moved, slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something that might bite. Maris didn't resist. She didn't need to. The moment had already happened. The crack in the court's illusion was already visible. Resistance now would turn it into open war. So she allowed the guards to take her arms. She kept her hands loose, palms still open, the picture of obedience rebuilt over the blade. As they led her down the aisle between the long tables, whispers began to rise, thin at first, then multiplying as shock turned into fear. "Omega. Did you see? That was the prince." "How?" Maris walked with her head bowed, shoulders rounded, the servant mask pulled tight. But every step echoed on marble like a bell. Behind her, Kalen's stare burned into her back, heavy with promise and hate. Above, banners fluttered in the heat of the braziers, crimson and gold, as if the court itself was trying to pretend nothing had changed. Yet the silence had already broken. And the fear flooding into the whispers wasn't for Maris. It was for what she had just proven could exist in plain sight. The guards escorted her away as Ironfang Court watched, frozen, uncertain, and suddenly aware that hierarchy was only as strong as the moment no one dared to shatter it. The corridor swallowed the sound of the feast behind them. Stone walls replaced banners. Torchlight thinned. The air cooled the deeper they went, as if the palace itself wanted distance from what had just happened in its great hall. Maris walked between two guards with her head bowed and her hands bound, not tightly, not cruelly, but with the careful restraint men used on something they didn't understand. Their armor scraped softly with each step. Neither spoke. Neither laughed. Behind them, the whispers of Ironfang Court followed like smoke. "Omega. Did you see his face? That wasn't luck." "What was that?" Maris kept her breathing even. Invisibility was gone. But control she could still hold. They led her down a narrow stairwell carved into the palace's older bones. The stone here was darker, rougher, fitted with the blunt practicality of defensive architecture rather than decoration. An iron door waited at the bottom, flanked by a single brazier whose flame burned low and steady. North Bastion. The guards pushed the door open and ushered her into a cell that smelled faintly of damp and cold iron. No straw. No comforts. Just a bench bolted into the wall and a drain cut into the floor like a reminder. The door closed. The lock turned. Then silence settled. Maris stood still for a full minute after they left, listening to the cadence of footsteps retreating, measuring the spacing between patrols by sound. Habit. Conditioning. The kind of habit that remained long after you stopped needing it, like a scar that ached before storms. 2 guards at the door. One shifts his weight every 16 seconds. The other clears his throat too often when he's nervous. There was a narrow slit high in the wall where moonlight bled through in a pale line. Beyond it, the night was a blur of cold air and distant torch glow. Maris sat on the bench with controlled slowness and tested her bindings subtly. Rope. Not chain. A decision. A question. They didn't know what she was. They only knew what she had done. Maris stared at her hands, at the faint tremor she refused to acknowledge. The bruise on her hip throbbed, deep and spreading. Her throat burned where Kaelin's fingers had pressed. The ache was ordinary. What wasn't ordinary was the absence inside her. No adrenaline crash. No panic. No relief. Just a quiet, sterile awareness that her life had shifted onto a different track, and the old one was already vanishing behind her. A memory rose uninvited, bright white lights, a cuff stamped with a number, a voice saying, "Liabilities get killed. Numbers don't." Maris closed her eyes and forced the image down. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Time in stone rooms was fluid. The only measure was the rhythm of guards and the steady breathing of a palace that pretended it had not just witnessed its heir put face first onto marble by a servant. Then the footsteps returned. But not the heavy scrape of patrol boots. These were slower. Deliberate. Unhurried. A key slid into the lock. The door opened. One guard entered first, eyes darting, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Another followed, then stepped aside, as if making room for something larger than himself. King Roderick Draven entered the cell without ceremony. No crown. No cape. No entourages. Just a man in dark clothing that fit him like a blade fitted sheath. Torchlight caught the planes of his face and left the rest in shadow. Authority without spectacle. Maris rose and lowered her head. "Your Majesty." The king looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He didn't look at her like Kaelin had, like prey. He looked at her the way a strategist looks at a map that has just changed. "Sit," he said. Maris obeyed, posture carefully neutral. Hands still bound, resting on her lap. The king remained standing. One of the guards offered him a stool. He ignored it. "I have reviewed your service records," he said calmly. Maris's stomach tightened, almost imperceptible. The mask didn't move. "You have 3 years in the palace," he continued. "Assigned by intake order as rejected Omega labor. No family claim. No bonded status. No history beyond a single village registry entry that appears," he paused, as if selecting the cleanest word, thin. Maris said nothing. The king's gaze sharpened. That entry is false. Not a question. A statement. Maris felt the rope around her wrists like a clock ticking. He stepped closer, just enough to turn the cell's small space into something tighter. Your name, Maris Vale, he said, doesn't exist before 3 years ago. No childhood tax marks. No trade registry. No temple record. He tilted his head slightly. Either you are the most forgettable person in the realm, or you were made to be untraceable. Maris kept her eyes lowered, because meeting his gaze would invite him in. You moved tonight, the king said. Not like a servant. Not like a frightened Omega defending herself with luck. You used structure. Leverage. Controlled neutralization. No wasted motion. His voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it, recognition with teeth. That pattern, he said softly, was designed. Taught. Repeated until it became instinct. Maris's pulse remained steady by force. The king let the silence stretch until it started to feel like pressure. Then he said, as if placing a blade on the table between them, Black Veil. Maris's breath almost caught. Almost. The name hung in the cell like smoke. She had not heard it spoken aloud in years. Not since the day the man with the royal seal said the initiative would be dissolved and the assets would be removed. Not since the halls under the supply wing became a grave. Maris's hands tightened against the rope. Her voice, when it came, was careful. I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty. The king didn't react to the lie. He expected it. He reached into his coat and removed a folded parchment. Not a threat. Not a weapon. A document. He opened it and held it so she could see. It was a transfer order with a royal seal, older, faded at the edges. Names redacted. Dates blurred by time. But one line remained. Black Veil Initiative, Omega Intake Allocation. The king watched her face for cracks. Maris kept it smooth. Then he produced another sheet. A list of missing supply consignments from the same period. Food. Medical. Steel. Things that disappeared into a program that officially did not exist. The numbers were neat. The handwriting precise. The king said quietly, someone erased the initiative's surface traces. But erasing a machine leaves fingerprints in what the machine consumed. He lowered the papers. You are one of its fingerprints. Maris's throat felt tight. Not from fear, something colder. Because denial was now a thin veil over a deep pit. And pits, once looked into, demanded truth. Maris lifted her eyes then, slowly, not to challenge him, but because the moment required it. The king's gaze met hers. Not cruel. Not kind. Unforgivingly intelligent. What are you? He asked. The cell seemed to dim around the question. Maris could feel her training waiting behind her ribs like an animal held on a leash. Lie, it whispered. Survive. Disappear. But she was already visible. Already chosen. Already impossible to unsee. So she made her decision the way she had made it in the banquet hall. Without drama. Without rage. With cold clarity. I was recruited, she said, voice low. Because no one would miss me. The king did not move. Maris continued, words sliding out like a blade drawn slowly to avoid catching on bone. Rejected omegas were the best kind of tools. No family to protest. No allies to question. No lineage to trace. The court could take us and nobody would ask where we went. The king's jaw tightened a fraction. He stayed silent. They taught us to move quietly, Maris said. To become furniture. Shadows. Air. To enter rooms without being noticed and leave them changed. She looked down at her bound hands. They took our names first. Then they took our voices. Then they took our mercy. The king's gaze did not leave her. Who ran it? Maris hesitated for the first time. Not because she didn't know. Because saying it made it real again. I never saw the highest layer, she said. We saw instructors. Handlers. People who wore no crest and left no paper. But the orders came from above. Always above. The king's eyes narrowed. And the purge? Maris's mouth went dry. She nodded once. When the court decided the program was inconvenient, they didn't close it. They erased it. Her fingers flexed. Rope creaked softly. One by one, she said. Operatives started dying. Not executions. Not openly. Accidents. Falls downstairs. Illness that took them in hours. Carriage wheels that came loose at the wrong time. Blades placed in the dark where they'd be blamed on thieves. Maris looked up again. Too clean to be accidents. The king's voice was a low murmur. And you survived. I ran, Maris said. Not because I was brave. Because I heard the order. She swallowed. I heard my number listed with the others. The king waited. Maris leaned forward slightly, as if the truth itself required closeness. I hid in the palace because it was the last place anyone would look for a surviving Black Veil asset. What hunter searches for a wolf in his own hearth? The king's expression didn't change, but something in the air did, an alignment, as if pieces were clicking into place. Proof, he said. Do you have proof? Maris exhaled once, steady. Then she shifted on the bench and, with careful movements, slid her bound hands beneath the waistband of her skirt. The guards tensed. The king lifted a hand. They froze. Maris drew out a thin packet wrapped in oilcloth, sealed against moisture and sweat. It had been hidden close to her skin for years. A secret pressed into her body like a second heartbeat. She set it on the bench between them. The king stared at it, then at her. You carried this through 3 years of palace servitude. Maris's voice was flat. It's the only reason I'm still alive. The king opened it. Inside were folded pages, orders, requisitions, signatures. Names she had memorized even when she dared not look at them too long. A supply diversion log. A sealed directive stamped with the royal mark. And beneath it all, one page that mattered more than the rest. An execution warrant. Her execution warrant. Stamped. Signed. Official. The king's eyes moved across the document with the stillness of a man reading his own court's betrayal in ink. When he reached the signature line, his gaze stopped. It didn't go cold. It went dangerous. Maris watched his pupils tighten. He looked up slowly. Verine Holt. High Chancellor Verine Holt. The king's closest advisor. The court's calm voice. The man who spoke of stability while moving pieces in the dark. Maris didn't nod. Didn't need to. The warrant was its own confession. The king sat down then, not because he was weakened, but because the weight of what he'd just confirmed demanded a different posture. His elbows rested on his knees. The documents lay open in his hands like a wound. Treason, he said quietly, as if tasting the word. Worse, Maris replied. Treason with clean hands. The king's gaze lifted to her again. You understand what you've done tonight. Maris's voice remained even. I survived. No, the king said, and there was iron in it now. You shattered a visible order in front of the entire court. My son's humiliation will not stay contained. The nobles will talk. My enemies will listen. Maris stared at the floor drain, at the way it cut into stone like a mouth. Then kill me, she said. Not pleading. Just naming the simplest outcome. The king was silent for a long moment. Then he said, that is what Holt would do. Maris's eyes flicked up. King Roderick's expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear. Holt purged Black Veil to remove witnesses. If I execute you now, I become his hand. Maris's fingers tightened slightly. Then what do you want? The king stood again. Authority reassembled around him without effort. I want the truth to bite back, he said. He stepped closer to the bench, close enough that Maris could smell the faint smoke of torchlight on his clothes. If Holt believes Black Veil is extinct, he will grow careless. If he learns an asset survived, he will move to erase you, and in moving, he will expose himself. Maris's spine chilled. You want to use me? Yes, the king said bluntly. No lies. No comfort. And you want to live? Maris held his gaze. Living isn't the same as safety. Safety doesn't exist in this court, the king replied. Only leverage. He nodded toward the documents. You have leverage. I have authority. Together, we can cut Holt out. Maris's mouth felt tight. Kaelin will kill me. The king's eyes didn't soften. Kaelin will try. The words landed like a verdict. King Roderick continued, I will not hide you. Hiding you implies shame, fear, weakness. It invites whispers that I'm protecting an Omega against my own blood. Maris's pulse remained steady by sheer will. You will be visible, the king said. Very visible. Maris understood immediately. Visibility was bait. A weapon, if you could survive long enough to wield it. A punishment, she said softly, already seeing the shape of the story the court would be fed. The king inclined his head once. Publicly, you will be assigned to palace security as penance for laying hands on the prince. A servant elevated into a leashholder's role. It will infuriate the nobles. It will draw eyes. It will draw knives. Maris's throat burned. And privately? Privately, the king said, you will help me dismantle the rot inside my court. Maris sat very still. The offer was not kindness. It was strategy. But it was also a door. A way out of the drain floor fate she had outrun for years. Maris looked down at her bound hands. If I accept, she said quietly, I will be hunted. The king's voice was low. You already are. The only difference is whether you're hunted alone. Maris exhaled once, slow and controlled. Invisibility had failed. It had always been temporary. A borrowed shelter. A fragile illusion. Now the only option left was to become what they feared. She lifted her chin. I accept. The king nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer. Unbind her, he told the guards. The rope loosened. Blood returned to Maris's wrists in pins and heat. She flexed her fingers once, subtle, testing, alive. King Roderick gathered the oilcloth packet and tucked it into his coat. Your quarters will change tonight, he said. You will be watched. You will be tested. You will be provoked. Maris's voice was quiet. Good. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the word amused him in a grim way. Do not mistake this for freedom, Maris Vale. I won't. He paused at the door, then looked back. And do not use that technique again unless you mean to break what remains. Maris's gaze held steady. Understood. The king left. The door shut. The lock turned. But the cell no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a threshold. By dawn, Maris was no longer in North Bastion. They moved her through corridors most servants never saw, passageways behind walls, staircases tucked into old stone, doors that opened only for seals and authority. The palace was a beast, and she was being carried deeper into its ribs. When they finally stopped, she stood in a narrow chamber outfitted not with straw and iron, but with weapon racks, training mats, and a small window slit overlooking the inner yard. Security quarters. A new kind of cage. A guard handed her a folded uniform, dark, fitted, plain. Practical. Built for movement. Not silk. Not servant cloth. Maris ran her fingers over it once, feeling the fabric's weight. A different mask. Outside the slit window, the training yard below was waking. Soldiers moved in pairs, practicing forms. Steel rang softly in the morning air. Maris stepped closer. And saw him. Prince Kaelan Draven stood at the yard's edge, surrounded by two companions. His posture was rigid with contained fury. His jaw clenched as if the memory of marble still lived in his bones. He looked up. Their eyes met through the narrow window slit, distance, stone, iron, and court law separating them like paper. Kaelan's stare was a promise. Not a threat. Not a tantrum. A vow. Maris didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She let him see her standing there in the new quarters, in the shadow of the king's authority, wearing the beginning of a different life. Visible prey. Armored truth. She understood, in that silent exchange, what the king's bargain truly meant. The Black Veil was not a ghost story anymore. It was a living thing again, breathing, watched, hated. And the hunt, dormant for years, had just resumed. Maris turned from the window and lifted the uniform. For the first time in a long time, she didn't fold her danger away. She put it on. If this story caught your attention, subscribe so you don't miss the next tale and tell us in the comment section your best moment.